Hey, you all, it's Adam and Akbar. Greetings. This is our first lecture in our last two modules, modules 6 and 7 on policy for science and science for policy, really looking at science now in its social context. Today, talking about autonomy, accountability, and broader impacts. So let me show you Akbar. My gosh, right away, we got problems. Here we go. Okay. Here's the outline. A little color coding, a new idea that Akbar had, because there's really two objectives here. Overall, we're going to introduce these modules, policy for science, science for policy, and do it in two ways. One with a broad overview, so that's going to be the first part of the lecture, the sections that I have in blue here. And then secondly, with a critical investigation of a landmark report on the relationship between science and society. I'm talking about Science, the Endless Frontier, and you'll note in your syllabus that for this week, I'm asking you to read just chapters 1 and 3 from that report, which you can find online. I think I might have also put a PDF in Canvas. So on the first part, broad overview, a little bit on science-society relationships. I have a 4-part taxonomy of ethical issues within that relationship. Clarify these terms, science for policy, policy for science, and then talk a bit about autonomy and accountability and the balance between those. Then we'll shift to this report by Vannever Bush and the kind of linear model for understanding that balance of autonomy and accountability. We'll have some critiques of that model, and at the end, I've got a kind of bonus quadrant, past year's quadrant, that we'll talk about. So a lot to cover. But let me emphasize, this lecture is really rooted in the assigned readings for you this week. So the broad stuff is recapitulating a lot of things in the chapter 9 in your textbook, which you need to read. And the more focused stuff, of course, is on Science, the Endless Frontier. Again, I'm having you read chapters 1 and 3. So I hope this just works to supplement those readings. Okay, so general points here. We're moving from the society of science to science and society. And of course, we've been talking about science and society all along, but now that's really going to be our focus. So another way to see this, part A here, is from how to conduct good science, like the normative structure built into science, right? Responsible conduct of research, those kinds of ethical questions. Moving from those to the ethical questions about what kind of science to pursue. In your textbook, we start with the embryonic stem cell case study, which was on the desk of George W. Bush when he became president, as a really good example of the kinds of ways in which science bleeds into society, and it's really hard to disentangle them. And so these broader moral, cultural, even religious questions, all with this sort of ethical dimensions that come about with embryonic stem cells and other things. Point C here, more broadly, the things that we're talking about when it comes to science and society, one of the simplest ways is just look at science budgets. You know, there's limited resources. You can only fund so much. So what science are you going to do? Budgets are ethical statements. You know, it tells you what do you value and what don't you value? Where are you putting your money? More recently, very recently, the chance at a Trump campaign rally to fire Fauci, Fauci being Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's leading infectious disease expert. That's a very, I would say, ominous case of the ethical dimensions of the relationship between science and society. The crowd wanting Trump to fire Fauci because they believe that he's giving them false information or something. So these are real, very important issues here at the interfaces of science and society. So it's a mess in some way, like how to get around all of these issues. I'll just try to give you four ways in which you would see ethics happening at these interfaces of science and society. One, you're going to have ethical issues about finite resources, like we talked about. Money. There's only so much money, which means you can only fund so much research. So you can't escape ethical questions about what are we going to prioritize. Two, incomplete knowledge. We're almost always acting under conditions of uncertainty. Then you get to ethical questions about how do you weigh different risks, different costs and benefits, and different uncertainties about which direction you're going to go. So there's going to be ethical questions there. Here's a big one: ethical pluralism, deep disagreements about values. One of the reasons we chose the embryonic stem cell research, a case study, is because that's a very clear illustration of a pluralistic society having different values. There's no way to escape those when it comes to talking about what kind of science we're going to do, right? And then I added this one, which I don't think was nearly as clear when we wrote the book way back in 2012. Our fractured media landscape. Now, not just disagreement about values, but deep disagreements about facts, to the point where it seems like people are almost living in different realities. That, of course, raises all sorts of ethical questions about where do you get your information from? How do you talk across these deep divides? How do you know who's telling the truth? Okay, so that's just a little taxonomy of, okay, Adam, we're in this land of science and society. Give me something to kind of hang my thoughts on. These are four things you can kind of think about. These are four boxes in which you would see ethical questions arising. Okay, now I'm using these terms, science for policy and policy for science, just to be clear about what we mean by those. Science for policy just means the use of science to inform decisions. A fundamental feature of, I would say, any sort of government or organization, but certainly in modern bureaucratic democratic societies, science informing decisions is a big aspect of our public life. You also have policy for science, that is, decisions about the conduct of science. And again, here, budget decisions are the clearest example. What kinds of R&D are we going to fund? That's a policy for science. Okay. Examples. Again, the embryonic stem cell research case exemplifies both of these dimensions. And often, science for policy and policy for science are interwoven. So here you had to have science informing President Bush's policy about whether or to what kind of embryonic stem cell research he was going to fund, because you need to know what kind of stem cell lines were out there and what the impacts of different decisions would be. And so you're taking in science to inform your decision. But obviously also in this case, this is a policy for science because it's a decision about how we're going to conduct this kind of research, right? Or to give you a more recent example, think of the pandemic. You have lots of different sciences for policies going on. Science informing decision makers, for example, about wearing masks in public places, social distancing, about the costs and benefits of various shutdown orders in the economy, etc. Right? And you have policy for science going on. One example in the US, this Operation Warp Speed, to put a ton of resources behind the development of a vaccine. That's a decision about the conduct of science. Also, I put here challenge trials, decisions about whether to deliberately infect people with the virus to test those vaccines, and you could think of other examples as well. Okay, so in other words, those are kind of things we want to think about in these modules as we wrap up this course. My focus here now will be on this balance between autonomy and accountability. Autonomy from the Latin word autonomos, auto, self, like automobile, nomos, law, self-legislating. So autonomy is like something being in charge of itself, right? And accountability, which would be that something having to be responsible to or accountable to a wider context which it finds itself in, right? So there's going to be a tension here, is what I'm saying, or a balance when it comes to science. Science as having its own autonomy and needing to be accountable to society. So the way I put it here is the trick, it's almost like a paradox, but it's really a balance. Yes, of course, on one hand, you want to keep politics out of science. You don't want, for example, scientists being fired just because they have their message, although rigorous and responsible and factual, is unpopular. You need to shield science from that kind of political influence. Yet you also need to recognize science operates within the context of other goods, other social values. And so science can't be this overriding moral imperative to just do the science. That doesn't even quite make sense. Well, which science, right? There needs to be some accountability for science to society, especially because society is investing resources and trust in science, right? So you can't just necessarily give them a blank check and say, do whatever the heck you want. So where do we find that balance? Simultaneously separating science from its political context and situating it in that context. Okay, in we go to Vannever Bush's report, Science, the Endless Frontier, because that is a report that has shaped the way we think about this balancing act, accountability and autonomy. It's shaped the way we think about the science-society relationship for now, what, 65 years, or you do the math, what is that, 70? I can't do the math. A long time. Must be 75 years, isn't it? I don't know. You figure it out for me. So what's the context here a little bit? The war, World War II, in one way, a big boom for scientists. Lots of money poured into research and development, right? That's how we were going to win the war, is by out-teching, out-sciencing the enemy. But it came with a loss of autonomy. So scientists got lots of resources, but they didn't get to do whatever they wanted. The government said, here's a bunch of money, figure out the bomb, figure out the radar, right? Figure out whatever technology it is we need. So you don't have autonomy. So Vannever Bush, by the way, who was like Robert Oppenheimer's boss, Vannever Bush, people don't know about Vannever Bush. He was the head of the US R&D effort during the war, and in many ways responsible for victory for the Allies in the war because he successfully managed these big R&D projects. So Science, the Endless Frontier was a report written by Bush to the president saying, what should our science policy look like in a peacetime, so after the war? What's the roadmap for that? And a key part that you'll notice in reading this, I hope, or at least let me highlight it for you. Vannever Bush, I don't think he coined, but he popularized this phrase, basic research or basic science. You see, not pure science, because pure sounds like it's unconnected to anything, it's not relevant. But basic, that makes it sound like it's at the foundations, right? The basis of something. So the idea was basic research will form the foundation of society, of social progress. You should also know that Science, the Endless Frontier is the blueprint for the National Science Foundation. Okay? So the document you're reading, pieces of it, is the original idea of the National Science Foundation. It's also, like I said, the blueprint for our imagination about how science relates to society. That's why it's so influential. So even if you've never heard of this report, it has worked its way into our collective cultural consciousness as a kind of an answer to these questions around science and society. And I think the answer in many ways is, look, give money to science. Science will figure stuff out and we'll be better off as a result. That's kind of the contract, right? Progress. Let's look at it in a little more detail. Okay. So that's a little bit of the context for it. What I want to say to you is the image of science in society that Vannever Bush paints for the president in Science, the Endless Frontier has now been described as the linear model, okay? And it is heavy on scientific autonomy, okay? So in that balancing act, it balances, it tips it way over to scientific autonomy. Here's his main idea. Scientific progress automatically leads to social progress, okay? And what do we mean by scientific progress? Here, key quote. This is one I want you to note. Scientific progress on a broad front results from the free play of free intellects working on subjects of their own choice and in the manner dictated by their curiosity for exploration of the unknown. In other words, give scientists the money to research whatever they're interested in. And we don't know how, but that will result in improvements to society. That's kind of the main message of this report. Science is the foundation of social progress. But we can't, it's like a mystery, right? We can't determine in advance how science is going to push progress forward. All we know is that it is going to happen. So in a way, we just need to trust in scientists to do their own thing, and good results will happen. In other words, if it is good science as judged by your scientific peers, it's good for society. So the scientist's moral responsibilities then are limited to the production of knowledge. So you do good science, right? So you do RCR, responsible conduct of research. And that's it, because no matter what happens after that, good things will result. We don't know how, we don't know when, but we know that science is the foundation of social progress. So if we do good science, like RCR, right, responsible science, follow Merton's norms, right, boom, social progress. So the linear model is what's sketched out in this. Now, that's not a term Vannever Bush used. It's a term that's been applied afterwards to kind of explain the model that he laid out, or the myth that is this sort of dominant ideology of the way science works in society, right? Let me give it to you. Money, right? You gotta have money to do science, especially big science like we have nowadays. What you do is basic science or basic research, right? Not pure science, but basic. That whatever you're studying will be put into a reservoir of knowledge that is a peer-reviewed collection of scientific journals, right? Others can pull from that reservoir and apply that basic knowledge to whatever problem they're working on. And the result will be happiness, health, wealth, social progress. That's Vannever Bush's outline. And by the way, I won't take time here because I'm going to yak on too long as it is, but look up Vannever Bush. Interesting and brilliant man. Here he is looking at, I think, his differential analyzer. In a way, he kind of came up with computer technology and hyperlinks like the internet in conceptual and rudimentary forms. I mean, he was ahead of his time. Amazingly brilliant guy. Okay, so that's the linear model. Give money to science to do basic research, that is to pursue their own interests, and it will eventually, although we don't know how, lead to social progress. Now, those of you who know South Park might recognize something like this. So now I'm going to critique the linear model and say it's like the underpants stealing gnomes in that one episode of South Park. If you haven't seen the episode, basically, there's an episode where everybody's underpants are going missing. And the main characters discover what's going on. It's these gnomes who are taking all these underpants into their like underground cave lair. And they ask the gnomes, why are you stealing people's underpants? Okay. And they go, I don't know. And one guy, and he asks his buddy, and then they put up this business model. Phase 1, collect underpants. Okay. Phase 2, it's just a question mark, kind of shrug your shoulders. Phase 3, profit, right? So you could critique the linear model on this basis. Phase 1, conduct basic research. Phase 2, Phase 3, better society, okay? That, I think, is an interesting critique of the linear model. It doesn't have any answer for what is the mechanism that you get from basic research, which is, again, researchers studying whatever the heck they want, to actually solving real-world social problems, right? Is that really how it works? Or is it kind of a shoulder shrug? And it's really just a way to collect underpants. I mean, do basic research, get money for whatever science you want to do. It seems like the scientists aren't being held accountable for this narrative about how they're going to be improving society. So that's one critique, right? So one problem. Where's the accountability mechanism here, right? It's sort of like a blank check. Hey, study whatever you want, and we'll just sort of trust that it'll make society better at the back end. There's another problem, a second problem, and it's related to the first. What about negative impacts? Or grimpacts, okay? Negative impacts, grimpacts. So the claim in the linear model is that science will impact society positively, right? The first critique is, well, you don't tell us how that's actually going to happen. It's just sort of a shoulder shrugging, I don't know, let's let scientists do their thing, and then eventually we'll be better, right? Here's the other critique is, well, what about bad things? So here's the linear model again, money, basic science, put in a reservoir of knowledge, you get good things. Oh, but wait a second, you can also get bad things, right? Aren't there negative impacts of research? I use the same picture of a Hummer, or is this a Humvee, I think, to indicate even the same thing can be both good and bad, right? At least depending on who's looking at it. In fact, that's what I put here. The same impact is often both good and bad. Think about nuclear power. It's great, carbon-free electricity, but also, oh my gosh, it could blow up a city. Walmart, great. Everything's in one place, low prices. Oh, but you're also decimating small town, downtown communities, right? It's not necessarily a scientific example. Antibiotics, right? Great, curing diseases, but also, oh, now we're creating antibiotic resistant bacteria, which are worse than what we had before. So just to say there are these mixed impacts of science on society, and the linear model doesn't give us a mechanism, doesn't give us the imagination to account for those, okay? So really, ever since Vannever Bush wrote this report, there has been pushback against this. In one sense, as an ideology or a conceptual model, but also just the way we practically do science in society, trying to say we need to account for more things. We need to account for how science actually transforms into impacts, and we need to account for the possibility of negative impacts on society. That's the big discussion, I think, now. And I'll kind of end on that. Ever since the end of the Cold War, that has been the big discussion. Now, why the end of the Cold War? Well, because throughout the Cold War, this kind of linear model could be justified by we got to beat the Russians, so we just got to have a space program and we got to have whatever because we're just going to have more R&D than them, right? So you could kind of just, in a way, write a blank check to science because there was still this enemy that we were fighting. But when that was over, there was a real big moment of accountability and questioning, like, why are we spending all this money on research and development? And how do we know it's actually going to solve the actual problems we've got? So that's been, ever since then, there's been this accountability moment. Two things I want to mention. There's a whole bunch of examples. I just picked two. In 1990, the Human Genome Project was launched, which was this race to map the human genome. Now, people had the forethought to say, you know what? Having a map of the human genome might raise some ethical issues. And so as a part of this program, they built in what is called ELSI, Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications Research. Now, this isn't a perfect mechanism, but at least it's a way to say, look, let's try to account for the possibility of bad impacts. Let's try to account for all the ethical questions that are going to happen anyways when it comes to research. And let's try to have that as a part of the actual research program. So 2 to 3% of the funding for this program was actually diverted to ethicists, social scientists, ideally to work hand in hand with the natural scientists to try to help everybody handle the ethical dimensions of this massive research project. So that's one of the things I have in mind with the accountability culture. It's not wiping away autonomy of scientists entirely, but is trying to contextualize that autonomy within this wider ecosystem of values, right, going on. The other thing I want to mention in the same vein is in 1997, the National Science Foundation, again, and this is what came out of Science, the Endless Frontier. Ever since, so from 45 to 97, there was really one criterion for the National Science Foundation giving scientists money, and that was, is it good science? That is it good science as defined by scientists? Does the peer community find this interesting and valid? In 1997, they added a second criterion for evaluating research proposals. So are we going to give you money or not, right? We're not only going to ask now, is it good science as defined by scientists? We're going to ask about its broader impacts on society. And the second criterion, broader impacts, has to be weighted equally with scientific merit, okay? This is a huge shift, and it's the biggest indicator probably of the accountability culture now that's taken root, not just in the US, but around the world. We need to have mechanisms to make sure scientists are thinking about the impacts of their research on society at large. Okay. Last slide. Akbar translates German. Why German? Because I could only find this quadrant in German for some reason on the internet. Let me take this slow a bit. I know I'm dragging on too long, but this is the last thing, okay? And I think this is important. So what am I doing here? This is another way to think beyond the linear model. So to think about different kinds of science and different ways science might relate to society. So this is actually developed in the 1997 book by Donald Stokes. I think I've got this linked in your notes if you're interested. It is called Pasteur's Quadrant. So you see up here, the upper right-hand side, that's the one I'm going to be most interested in. But let me just lay out the parameters for you here. So as you go from left to right, you're talking about more socially relevant or useful knowledge, okay? As you go from bottom to top, you're talking about from less fundamental understanding to more fundamental understanding. So when you have two axes like that, you can create a quadrant, and that's what's going on here. So pick the, here it is. Pick the top left, Bohr, but Niels Bohr as an example, okay, of pure research. So high fundamental understanding, but low, because we're left here, in terms of socially relevant or useful. So when you think about pure physics, right, they're not trying to make a better toothbrush or something, but they really are trying to understand the dynamics of the universe. Okay, so they're going to be high on that scale and left on the other scale. Go down here, Edison, kind of the opposite, right, when you travel diagonally. Edison, applied research and invention. So low in terms of trying to find fundamental new understandings about the working of the universe, right? That wasn't Edison's deal, okay? Maybe a little bit of that, but not his main shtick. But high, or that is on the right, in terms of he really wanted to have relevant, useful applications, right? Light bulbs and communication devices, and these are things that are going to transform and impact society. Right? So those are kind of your opposites in some sense. Now this quadrant, Stokes, who wrote the book, didn't know what to put here. Yeah, what would you put for something that's not interested in developing fundamentally understanding of the universe or being socially useful or relevant, right? Stokes put stamp collecting as an example that you might put here, but maybe just nothing, right? Stamp collecting because it's not doing fundamental research and it's not really useful, okay? That's what's not interesting. Finally, one we're really interested in is Pasteur's Quadrant, which was the name of Stokes' book. Pasteur, right, the great French field scientist. I hope you can see this. Use-inspired basic research. So it's high here because he is interested in understanding, for example, how do diseases propagate? Why is it that maggots grow on old milk or meat or something like that, right? Why do we have a fly problem going on here? He wanted to know both what are the fundamental mechanisms driving these natural phenomena. So he's high on that scale. But he wanted to know answers to those questions in the context of and for the purposes of solving real world problems. So he's on the right side. So Pasteur's Quadrant, you might say, in our days, would be something more like the Department of Defense, maybe to take a slightly provocative example of, yeah, the Department of Defense would do some research that's interested in solving fundamental problems about the behavior of materials, say, but in the context of providing security and defense for a nation, right? And it may be in these agencies or like the Department of Agriculture that wants to know something fundamentally about the way living organisms behave, but they want to know it in the context of growing more food for a growing population on the planet, right? So to sum it up, maybe the place we're going to find the most ethical, or at least the most interestingly ethical questions about science and society is in Pasteur's Quadrant, where we're both trying to find fundamental knowledge and address real world problems. Okay, enough of me. Until next time, Akbar and I, we wish you all the best, and may the force be with you.